The invasion and the encounter. The sky was burning red as fire fell from above, and the ground shook with the march of machines that did not belong to Earth. The people ran in every direction, and the cities turned into ruins in a matter of hours. The alien empire had come in full strength, with their ships that floated like black mountains in the clouds, and their weapons that tore through steel and stone as if it were nothing. Armies of Earth fought back with everything they had, but the difference in power was clear. The invaders were too strong, and the planet was already drowning in fear and despair. In the middle of this chaos, a single soldier named David stumbled through the smoke and dust, his uniform torn and his body covered in blood and dirt. He had been fighting for hours. His unit was gone, lost to the destruction and the endless wave of enemy fire, yet he kept moving forward, his mind filled with one thought: survive long enough to fight one more time, long enough to keep the land of his people alive. He carried a small pack with little food and water, but no hope of rescue. No command, no orders, only his will kept him going. The battle had taken him far from the main lines and into the broken countryside. Fields once green now burned, forests reduced to black skeletons, and the air heavy with ash. Every step he took was slow but steady until he heard a sound, not of gunfire or machines, but something softer, a low broken cry. It made him stop. His instincts told him to ignore it, to keep moving, because only death waited nearby. Yet something in the voice pulled him closer. He pushed through a line of broken trees and found her lying among the wreckage of a fallen craft, her armor shattered, her silver crown half broken, and her pale skin glowing faintly, even under layers of blood and dirt. She was no ordinary soldier. She was the queen of the invading empire. He recognized her face from the screens that had shown her demanding the surrender of Earth before the first strike. Her voice had promised mercy if humans obeyed, and fire if they resisted. And now here she was, broken and helpless. David froze. His first thought was simple: end her life, end the war. With one pull of the trigger, his hand even reached for his weapon. But then he saw the wound on her side, deep and bleeding. He saw how her hand trembled as she tried to move but could not. Her eyes met his, and there was no fire, no pride, only pain. She was his enemy, but she was also alive. And something in his heart twisted because he could not do it. He could not leave her to die like this. Not when he still had the strength to help. He knelt beside her, and she stared at him as if confused that a human had not already finished her. He said nothing at first, only tore part of his own uniform to bind her wound, and when she tried to speak, he told her to save her breath. He lifted her into his arms. Though his body screamed with pain, the weight almost broke him, but he did not stop. He only adjusted his grip and began to walk away from the battlefield. The land ahead was rough hills and broken roads. The nearest safe ground was far, maybe 40 miles or more. He did not know if he could make it, but he refused to leave her behind. Every step was slow and heavy, his breath sharp and shallow, yet he carried her, because somewhere inside he believed that saving one life, even the life of an enemy, still mattered. The queen, weak and barely conscious, spoke at last, her voice cracked with disbelief. "Why do you do this?" She whispered, "You should kill me. I brought this war to your world. I came to conquer your people." David did not look at her. He only answered, "Because it is the right thing, because even enemies do not have to be monsters." She said nothing more, but her eyes followed him with a look he did not understand, part confusion, part anger, part something else. As the sun began to set, the land glowed with fire and ash, the silence broken only by distant echoes of war. David kept walking. The queen's head rested against his shoulder, her crown slipping down, her hair tangled with blood and dust. She seemed less like a ruler and more like a fragile being, barely holding on to life, and though every bone in his body told him to hate her, he felt instead the weight of duty to protect life, because that was what made him human. Night came and the cold bit into him, but he did not stop. He found a ruined shelter, half collapsed, and there he laid her down. For a while he forced himself to rest, only long enough to catch his breath. He gave her the last of his water, even though his throat burned with thirst. She tried to refuse, but he placed the bottle to her lips anyway, and she drank in silence, her eyes never leaving him, as if trying to understand why a human soldier would waste his strength for someone who had sworn to destroy his kind. In those quiet hours the world seemed still, the war distant, though the fire still glowed in the horizon. David closed his eyes for a moment, but his mind stayed sharp. He knew patrols of her soldiers might be searching for her. He knew drones could find them at any time. But he also knew he could not stop. The journey had only begun, and if he was to save her, he would need to walk until his body gave out. He looked at her once more, her breathing slow but steady, her life in his hands, and he told himself no matter what he would see this through. When the first light of dawn touched the land, David rose again. He placed the queen back into his arms and started walking once more, his legs weak, his back screaming with pain, but his spirit unbroken. Behind them lay a ruined world. Ahead lay miles of danger, but between those two truths was his choice. And his choice was clear. He would carry her, he would save her, no matter how far, no matter how hard, because sometimes even in war, humanity is not measured by the power to kill, but by the strength to save. The struggle across harsh lands. The morning air was heavy with smoke and ash, and the land stretched out before David like a graveyard of broken earth. The trees were blackened bones, the rivers turned into muddy streams, carrying the ash of cities that once stood tall. He tightened his arms around the wounded queen and began his slow march again, each step dragging at his body, yet his will refused to give in. The queen rested in his hold, her eyes half open, her breathing shallow and uneven, her body weakened from blood loss and exhaustion. But she still managed to watch him with a gaze that was sharp even in pain. Hours passed and the path ahead grew cruel. The ground was not flat, but rising into steep hills covered with shattered stone. David's legs burned with effort, yet he kept moving. He stumbled more than once, nearly falling, but always steadying himself before she slipped from his arms. Sweat dripped down his face and mixed with the grime and blood already there. Still, he did not stop. He muttered to himself that if he stopped she would die, and he had already chosen that he would not let that happen. Queen finally spoke. Her voice was faint, but it carried a sharp edge. "Why do you keep doing this, human? You know who I am. You know what I have done to your world. Your people are dying under my command, and still you carry me across this wasteland." David did not look at her. His voice was low, and even because leaving you here is easy, killing you is easy. But what is hard is doing what is right, and what is right is saving a life, no matter whose it is. She fell silent for a long while, her mind circling around his words, as if they were strange tools she did not know how to hold in her hands. She had grown up in a world where weakness was punished, where mercy was not seen as a virtue, but as a flaw. Her empire had been built on conquest, strength, and obedience, yet this one broken soldier carried her at the cost of his own survival. He was an enemy, and yet he treated her like a burden worth protecting. Day wore on, the sun hidden behind clouds of smoke. David's stomach growled with hunger, but his pack carried only 2 small rations. He bit into one of them, chewing slowly, his eyes watching the ruined path, and then without a word he broke the other piece and placed it to the queen's lips. She looked at him with confusion, almost suspicion, as if expecting some trick, but he only said, "Eat. You need it more than I do." She resisted for a moment, then hunger overcame pride, and she ate in silence. By afternoon the march was harder, the hills steeper, and his legs trembled under the weight. His arms felt numb, yet he gritted his teeth and pressed forward. His boots slipped on loose stones, and once he fell to his knees. The queen cried out in pain. As the jolt shook her wound, he pushed himself up again, his breathing ragged but his determination untouched. She watched him then, not with anger, but with something softer, though she did not speak of it. Land around them was not empty. Wild beasts roamed where human towns once stood, creatures drawn by the fire and the scent of death. One such beast rose from the shadows, a wolf-like shape twisted by ash and hunger, its eyes glowing red and its teeth sharp. It snarled and stalked toward them. David set the queen down against a rock, though her eyes widened in alarm, and he pulled a small blade from his belt. He had no energy left for long fights, but when the creature lunged, he met it with desperate strength, slashing at its neck. The beast shrieked and thrashed, but he did not let go until it fell still on the ground. Blood coated his arm, and his chest rose and fell like a hammer against an anvil, but he stood there, breathing in harsh gasps. Before returning to the queen, he lifted her again, and she looked at him with a new expression, mixed with shock and something like respect. She said, "You fight like one who has nothing left to lose." He answered, "Maybe that is true, but I still have something to protect." Night came again, and the cold was worse than before. David found the ruins of an old farmhouse, broken walls, and half a roof. He laid her down gently and gathered scraps of wood to build a small fire. It took long minutes and shaking hands, but he managed. The flames brought a fragile warmth to the dead night. He gave her another sip of water from his pack. Though his own lips were cracked from thirst, she tried to push it away, but he said firmly, "Drink it. You need to live." As the fire flickered between them, she finally asked, "What is your name?" He answered, "David." She repeated it slowly, as if testing the sound of it in her mouth, then said, "Mine is Lyra, though on your world my name is spoken like a curse." He looked at her across the fire and replied, "A name is only a name. It is what you choose to do with it that matters." She lowered her gaze, not sure how to answer his simple words. The night stretched long with the sound of distant engines in the sky, drones searching for survivors, or maybe for her. David kept one hand on his blade, his eyes half closed yet always alert. Lyra watched him in silence, thinking of the thousands of humans who would have killed her on sight, thinking of how this one broken man carried her instead of ending her life. She did not understand it, but she could not ignore the weight of his choice. When dawn rose again, they started once more. The 40 miles still stretched endless before them, the journey already tearing his body apart, yet David carried her without complaint. His shoulders bent, his face hard with focus. Every mile felt like a mountain, every breath like fire, but he never slowed. And Lyra, though she tried to hold on to her hatred, found it slipping away, replaced with questions she could not answer. Why would an enemy show her mercy? Why would a human give everything for a queen who had sworn his people's destruction? Struggle was not only on the land, but inside her heart, and for the first time in her reign, she felt uncertainty. Not in her empire, not in her armies, but in the meaning of power itself. As she rested against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong, she realized that survival was not only about conquest. Sometimes it was about the quiet strength of one who refused to abandon what was right. The bond of survival. The sun climbed high above the broken land, and the air shimmered with heat. David's legs moved like heavy stones, but still he carried Lyra across the wasteland, each mile a battle against his body. His arms numb his back, screaming with pain, yet his will held stronger than steel. The queen rested against him, silent most of the time, her eyes half closed, but she watched him in ways she had not before. Her gaze no longer filled with anger or pride, but with something she could not name. The land ahead was cruel, dry plains, stretching without end. The ground cracked and thirsty, nothing alive for miles, except the wind that scraped against them. David felt his throat burn with thirst, but the small pack was almost empty. The last of the water sloshed faintly inside a canteen. He lifted it once and stared at it, thinking of his dry mouth, but then he held it to her lips. She tried to refuse, but he pressed it gently against her, and she drank a few sips, her voice rough as she whispered, "You will die if you give me all of it." He answered simply, "Then I will die, but you will live." The journey dragged on through the heat, his boots cutting into his skin, his shoulders raw from the way he carried. Sometimes he stumbled to his knees, but always pushed himself back up, never letting her fall. He did not count the hours, only the steps, each one bringing him closer to something he could not see, but still believed in. Lyra felt the rise and fall of his chest against her as he carried her, and with each step she wondered at this man who gave everything for nothing. By afternoon, the silence of the plains was broken by the sound of machines in the sky. Shadows moved Overhead drones sent to find her or to hunt the last survivors. David cursed under his breath and hurried toward a cluster of rocks. The only cover for miles. He set her down gently, then pulled a piece of torn metal from the ground and smeared ash across their bodies to hide the heat from sensors. The drones passed above their engines, roaring like thunder, but they did not stop. The shadows slid away across the horizon and the land was silent again. Lyra looked at him with a new expression, her voice soft and strange. You should have left me. They would have taken me back. You would have been free. But he shook his head and answered, they would have killed me. They would have killed all of us. Your army came for conquest, not rescue. She fell silent because she knew he was right. Her people did not value mercy. They valued power, and she had always believed that too, until now, as she watched a man waste his life for hers. When night came, the heat turned into freezing cold. The sky above filled with strange stars not hidden by city lights anymore. David found a cave in the side of a hill and carried her inside. It was damp and dark, but safer than the open plain. He gathered what little wood he had found along the way and sparked a small fire. The glow cast their faces in flickering light. He tore another strip of cloth from his uniform to clean her wound. She winced but did not pull away her eyes, watching him closely. She asked again, "Why do you fight so hard for me? What is it you hope to gain?" He looked at her across the fire, his face lined with exhaustion, and said, "I do not want anything. I do not need anything. I just know that no one deserves to be left to die, not even an enemy." For a long time she said nothing. The crackle of the fire, the sound of the wind outside the cave, filled the silence. She was a queen raised to believe in rule by strength. Her armies spread fear across worlds, and no one ever questioned her power, yet this broken human carried her 40 miles, not for glory, not for reward, but because of something she had no word for in her language. She finally whispered, "You are a fool," and yet her voice carried no anger, only something that sounded almost like sorrow. The next morning they left the cave, and the land grew harsher. Jagged cliffs and sharp rocks cut into the earth, climbed slowly, carrying her every step, measured every breath heavy. He slipped more than once, his hands scraped open against the stone, but he kept moving. The path was narrow and dangerous, and at one point, a section of rock gave way beneath him. He nearly fell into the chasm below, but he twisted his body to shield her and slammed against the stone with his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he held her tight and pulled himself back up. Lyra's eyes widened as she saw the blood on his arm. She whispered, "Why would you throw away your life like that for me?" His answer was quiet, "Because a life is not something to throw away, and I will not let yours be lost while I can still move." Her chest tightened with emotions she could not name. She was used to soldiers obeying her because they feared her wrath, not because they valued her life. Yet here was a man who fought not out of fear but out of choice. The day stretched on until the horizon glowed red with another storm, rolling in dust rising like walls of fire. David struggled through the wind, each step harder than the last. The dust stung his eyes and cut into his skin, but he did not stop. He wrapped his jacket around her to shield her body, and bent his head against the storm. When at last they found shelter in the hollow of a broken building, he collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with exhaustion, yet still his arms cradled her safely as if nothing else mattered. Through the night she watched him as he slept, sitting against the wall, his head bent forward, his body trembling from cold and fatigue. She realized then that this human was more dangerous to her than any weapon, because he carried something her empire could never break: the power of choice, the power of sacrifice. He had no army, no kingdom, no crown, yet his strength was greater than all she had known, and for the first time she felt doubt, not of her mission, but of herself. When dawn came she spoke softly, his name David. He stirred and looked at her, his eyes red from lack of sleep. She said, "I do not understand you. Your people fight us, your world burns, yet you choose to save me. What kind of man does this?" He looked at her with steady eyes and replied, "A human does this." Her heart trembled at those words, simple, yet heavy. They carried a truth she could not escape, and though she was a queen with 1,000 soldiers who would die at her command, she felt small before the weight of his quiet strength. The journey was far from over, but something had already changed between them, something deeper than survival, something she would carry long after the march was done. The turning point, the journey had become more than a march. It was a battle between life and death. With each step David felt his strength fading, yet his will stood firm. The 40 miles stretched endlessly before him, and the land was growing more dangerous with every passing hour. Shadows of machines moved across the horizon, and the sound of engines echoed in the air, like hunters searching for prey. He knew they were looking for her. He knew if they found them both, it would mean his death. But still he carried her against his chest, her head resting near his shoulder, her breathing weaker but steady. The queen spoke little now. Sometimes she tried to tell him to leave her to save himself, but he never listened. He only tightened his hold and told her softly, "No, not while I can still stand." She had commanded armies across the stars, yet she could not command him to abandon her. It unsettled her, and yet gave her something she did not know she needed, the certainty that someone had chosen her life without expecting anything in return. By midday, the silence of the wasteland was broken. The sound of metal feet pounding the earth reached his ears. David stopped, his body tense. He turned and saw them, shapes rising over the ridge, tall armored soldiers with glowing visors. Their weapons raised, their voices carried through the air in a language that needed no translation. They had found their queen. They had come to take her back. Lyra's eyes widened. She whispered, "They will kill you." David set her down gently against a rock, his own chest rising and falling like a hammer against steel. His hands gripped the small blade he had carried since the start, his gun long empty of bullets, but his spirit not empty. He looked at her and said, "Then let them try." She shook her head, her voice almost breaking. "You cannot fight them. You are only one man." He met her gaze and answered firmly, "One man is enough." Soldiers advanced, their armor gleaming in the smoky light. David stepped forward, placing himself between them and the wounded queen. The first soldier raised his weapon, but David rushed forward with a speed born of desperation. He struck with his blade, slashing across the weak point of the armor. Sparks flew. The aliens stumbled and fell. The others shouted and opened fire. David threw himself aside, rolling across the dirt, the shots burning into the ground. He rose again and charged like a storm. The fight was chaos. He ducked under swings of glowing weapons, slashed with his blade, and used every ounce of his strength. He was cut across the arm, blood running hot, but he did not fall. He tackled one soldier into the ground, ripping the weapon from its grasp, and fired blindly until the machine of war collapsed. He turned to another, striking hard again and again, though his body screamed in pain. Lyra watched helplessly, her heart pounding, as the man who should have been her enemy fought against her own soldiers, not to kill her but to protect her. She could hardly believe it. Each time she thought he would fall, he rose again. Each time he bled, he fought harder. His breath was ragged, his movements slower, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter than any weapon. The soldiers regrouped, 3 of them rushing him together. David swung the stolen weapon, blasting one aside, but another struck him across the chest. He fell to the ground, pain exploding through him, yet even on the ground he would not stop. He drove his blade upward into the enemy's chest, forcing it back. The last soldier raised his weapon to strike, but in that moment, Lyra raised her hand despite her wound and shouted a command, her voice sharp with authority. The soldier froze, uncertain. David seized the chance and struck it down. The battlefield fell silent, broken only by the sound of David's heavy breathing. He stumbled back to her, his face pale, blood soaking his side. He dropped to one knee before her, his body shaking, but his eyes steady. She whispered, "You are hurt badly. You should have left me to them." He shook his head and said, "I told you I will not leave you, not while I can stand." Her heart ached with emotions. She had never allowed herself to feel he was an enemy, yet he was also her shield. He had fought her own soldiers to protect her, something no one in her empire would ever do. She reached out weakly, her hand touching his arm, and whispered, "You are a fool," but her voice was soft, filled with something close to sorrow and admiration. They could not stay among the fallen soldiers. More would come soon. David lifted her once again, though his body protested every movement, his breath shallow, his steps unsteady. He carried her away from the place of battle into the deep ravines of stone, where the smoke from fires covered their trail. Each step was agony. His vision blurred, yet he pressed forward, because he knew if he stopped now, all of this would mean nothing. Lyra felt the heat of his body as he carried her. She could feel his strength slipping, yet his will never breaking. She whispered, "Why do you endure so much for me?" And his answer came with a voice hoarse but steady, "Because it is the only way I know to live, to save, not to destroy, to protect, not to abandon." She closed her eyes, hearing his words echo in her mind, stronger than any command. As night fell again, they found a hollow cave hidden beneath the rocks. David laid her down gently, his hands shaking. He collapsed beside her, unable to move for long moments, his chest heaving, his wounds bleeding, yet his eyes still watching the entrance, ready to fight again if needed. Lyra turned her head to look at him, and for the first time, she felt not like a queen of an empire, but like a woman who had been saved by someone she was meant to call her enemy. In that moment, she understood something no conquest had ever taught. Her power was not in fear or destruction. Power was in sacrifice, and in the will to protect. Even when there was nothing to gain, she whispered his name, David, softly, as if it were the only truth she knew now. And he turned his head toward her with weary eyes and whispered back, "You are safe for now." The silence that followed was not heavy, but filled with unspoken meaning. Both of them knew the journey was not over. More dangers waited, and his strength was running thin, yet something had changed in her heart. A choice forming deep inside, that when the time came she would no longer ignore the command of mercy. Cave was dark except for the dim glow of fading embers, and the sound of the wind that howled outside. David sat with his back against the stone wall, his body torn by wounds, his eyes heavy, yet his spirit unbroken. Lyra lay close to him, her breathing slow but stronger than before, her gaze fixed on the human who had carried her through firestorm and battle. He had nothing left to give, and still he gave more. She had never known such strength, not in the armies that obeyed her, not in the empire that worshipped her, only in this one man. When dawn came, the sky was thick with smoke. The distant roar of engines shook the earth. The alien fleet hung heavy above the horizon, their ships like shadows ready to deliver the final strike. David knew what it meant. Earth was running out of time. His people would be destroyed unless something changed. He pulled himself to his feet, lifting Lyra once again, though his body trembled under her weight. Each step now was agony. His vision blurred, but he forced his legs to move because the journey had to end. The 40 miles had to mean something. Path led them to the edge of a ruined city. Towers, once proud, now shattered like bones, sticking out of the earth. The silence here was heavy, the kind that follows death. David staggered through the broken streets, the queen resting against him, her eyes searching the sky for her soldiers. She knew they would be close. She knew the moment she revealed herself, the world could end or be saved, and the choice would be hers alone. Yet her heart battled between the queen she had been and the woman she had become. At last the shadows fell over them. Soldiers in dark armor descended from the sky, weapons ready. They surrounded David in a circle, their visors glowing, their voices cold and sharp. They demanded the queen be returned. They demanded the human be executed for daring to touch her. David held her tighter, though his legs could barely stand, his face pale, his blood dripping into the dirt. He said nothing, his silence itself a defiance. Lyra lifted her head, her voice weak but filled with authority. "Stop," she commanded. The soldiers froze, their weapons still aimed, but their bodies stiff with obedience. She looked at them, her eyes sharper than they had been in days. "I am your queen," she said, "and this human is under my protection." They shifted uneasily, confusion in their stance. No one had expected such words. David looked at her, his breath shallow, his body swaying on the edge of collapse. She met his eyes, and for the first time she smiled, though faintly. The general of her guard stepped forward, his voice filled with doubt. "My queen, this man is our enemy. His world is to be burned, his people destroyed. This is your will." She raised her hand and cut him off. "No. It is not my will, not anymore." Her voice carried through the broken city. "This human carried me through death itself. When you abandoned me, when you were not there to protect your queen, he risked his life not once, but again and again though. I was his enemy, though my armies destroyed his world, and he asked for nothing in return." The soldiers shifted again, unsure, their loyalty bound to her, but their training chained to conquest. She stood taller in David's arms, though weak, her voice thundered with new strength. "If my rule means anything, then hear this: earth will not burn, this world will not fall, not while I am queen. My command is mercy." The words struck like fire in the silence. The soldiers lowered their weapons. Some hesitated, but none dared defy her. David felt the weight of her command, and though his body was broken, his heart surged with a strength he had never felt. She had chosen to save his people, not because she was forced, not because she was weak, but because she had seen something greater in the act of one man. The fleet above shifted their formation, awaiting orders. The generals demanded confirmation, and Lyra gave it, her voice echoing through the comes of the empire. "Earth is not to be touched. Stand down. Withdraw and carry my words to every worldly rule. Mercy is strength, not weakness, and this is the law of your queen." The sky grew silent. The thunder of weapons faded. The fleet that had once prepared to burn Earth began to pull away, their shadows shrinking across the horizon. Humanity had been spared not by armies, not by weapons, but by the choice of one man who carried his enemy, and the choice of a queen who chose mercy instead of conquest. David finally collapsed, his knees giving way, his body falling to the ground. Lyra cried out weakly and tried to steady him, but he was too heavy, his breath ragged. She touched his face. Her own eyes filled with something she had never known before: gratitude, sorrow, and respect. She whispered, "You saved more than me. You saved your world, and you saved me." He looked at her with tired eyes and managed a faint smile before whispering, "I only did what was right." Then his eyes closed, and he slipped into unconsciousness, his body broken from the journey, but alive. Lyra turned to her soldiers, her voice sharp. "Tend to him, heal him. He is not a prisoner. He is not our enemy. He is the reason we are here." Soldiers obeyed, carrying him with care, their queen walking beside them. Though her steps were weak, she felt stronger than she had in her entire reign. She knew her empire would question her command. She knew wars would follow her choice. But she also knew she could never go back to who she had been. She had seen humanity not as weakness, but as a force greater than conquest, the strength to protect even an enemy, the will to carry another life for 40 endless miles. When David awoke days later, he found himself not in ruins, but in a quiet camp, his wounds healed by alien medicine. Lyra sat nearby, her crown restored, yet her eyes softer than before. She told him his world was safe. Her armies had withdrawn, her people obeyed her command. He tried to speak, but she stopped him gently and said, "You gave me more than life. You gave me a reason to change. I will never forget." David returned home to his people, weak but alive, carrying no banner, no medals, only the knowledge that he had saved his world by choosing mercy over hate. And though he never saw her again, he knew somewhere in the stars a queen carried the memory of a human who refused to let her die. And because of that one choice, 2 worlds had been forever changed. The end.